This is Measuring Up, where we like to talk about the art and science of public relations, but how the science is really the foundation of what drives it forward. During our last episode, we had a conversation with the great Mark Wiener, who's the Chief Insights Officer at Cognito. And during that conversation, he gave his outlook on the future of public relations and communications. Today, I'm honored to have Rob Key, who's the founder and chief executive officer of Converseon. And we're going to have a very interesting conversation about what's happening right now in social listening, analytics, natural language processing, and how this is going to impact the future of public relations and communications in particular. Uh, as many of you know, after spending many years at Cohen& Wolf, WPP, Rob has really been one of the pioneers in this ecosystem of natural language processing and analytics, and has spent a decade and a half uh, really investing in the foundational technology that makes what we do in public relations and communications significantly easier, significantly faster, and of course, significantly smarter as well. Rob, we're thrilled to have you as part of the videocast. Welcome.
Yeah, thanks very much for having me, Mo. Great to be here.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Rob, I think it's more than fair to say that you have one of the most unique perspectives on the evolution of social listening. So let's start there. How has this space really evolved over time? Recently we've seen a ton of consolidation of tools as an example, and that presents kind of an interesting dynamic moving forward from a peso standpoint. But you really have been a part of this space since the very beginning. So what
Yeah.
has changed and what's ahead?
No, well, thanks. It's been many years, probably more than I'd like to recognize. Converseon, we started in 2001. We were actually a social media agency up until about 2008. And in 2008, we moved into building technology. My background, I'm an English lit major, right? Came through the world of public relations. And I now get to spend my days with computational linguists, data scientists, and others. So we really are melding the linguistic part of the world together with the engineering part of the world. And computational linguistics has actually been around for 60 years, but it's made great advances over the last few years. Back in the early days, and I say it's 2006, 2007, 2008, everything was, and actually, up even until the last few years, it was largely a keyword driven approach. I knew coming out of public relations, the challenge was, and I think that challenge is still probably consistent today for many, is you're putting a lot of information out there or a lot of content out there, but you really don't know what the reactions are. They're kind of anecdotal, et cetera, et cetera. So social listening kind of, becomes that springboard for insight that we hadn't had. And so in the early days, it was, this is the age of GeoCities it was pretty basic stuff and very keyword driven. If you wanted to find a brand, you had to put the word in there. And then of course, then you find all kinds of stuff that you don't necessarily need. If you happen to be Ford Motor, you end up with all kinds of things about Gerald Ford, right? So it was very, very much keyword driven. And that went through that era of into just several years ago. In fact, there's still some platforms that are just very much keyword driven. But that's changed. Back in 2008, we actually were lucky enough to work with some of what I consider kind of the rock stars of AI-powered natural language processing, or NLP, Dr. Philip Resnick at the University of Maryland, and Jason Baldridge, who's professor at University of UT Austin, who's now at Google. And we started to apply machine learning to this technology. And what that really meant is that the machine learning algorithms needed to learn from humans about classifying this information. So you needed massive amounts of humans training systems. But the challenge is that humans also don't always agree on everything, believe it or not. Even for sentiment analysis, we have found that humans may only agree about 60, 80% of the time. So getting to a ground truth for not just sentiment, but things like trust or reputation is a real challenge of how do you get the proper definitions? How do you get the right training data? How do you get the right algorithms to learn from humans? And how do humans continue to nurture these models as they grow and evolve and be taken seriously? So what we have had happen is this movement from keywords to implicit meaning through artificial intelligence. So we can now classify language like humans do. So humans won't say, for example, I trust X brand. They'll say, maybe I use the product with my baby because my baby sleeps better. It's an expression of trust that we as humans understand. So the algorithms have now able to capture implicit meaning in the data. And interestingly, because humans don't always agree on coding, for example, the performance of the models is such that it actually exceeds human performance at scale, meaning humans aren't good at ground truth. So we have to have multiple trainers get to a ground truth, and these algorithms will exceed that performance of a single individual. So what's that done? Well, that's actually really broken open social listening into new worlds. So I think a lot of people still probably think of social listening as the platform box. And there's many good traditional social listening platforms out there, of which we have partnerships with many. And they're good for kind of looking for things quickly, finding some generalities and directionality. But the ability now for us to be able to classify language with great sophistication that can be customized to how the brand sees the world or how an industry is perceived, that could get beyond sentiment and into things like brand trust or reputation, has allowed it to open the door outside of its little box into areas of customer experience, into sustainability and corporate citizenship, into certainly reputation and communications, into brand health, et cetera, and of course product innovation. So this data is breaking out of its box, touching all these different parts of the organization, and that's allowed us to be able to go from kind of reactive and descriptive. So simply saying, hey, what are people saying about XYZ? Well, they said this yesterday, to being able to be predictive and prescriptive, meaning we can now begin to predict how people are going to react to things based on what we've seen historically and what they've done. Changes the game. This means that the data is predictive, it is quantitative, it can be anchored to business outcomes, and it also can be digested internally at organizations and taken very seriously outside of its box. And that simply means that no longer social listening should be living in a platform, kind of a walled off platform, but it's now an ecosystem. The best social listening platforms have API integrations that allow people to pick and choose different machine learning models, different solutions, transfer the data from one point to another, integrate with first party data, et cetera, so that you can really have great clarity at the center of truth, essentially, to organizations. And so it's a really exciting time. I mean, we've been doing this since 2008. And I think this year is the most exciting in terms of transformation and evolution.
Speaking of transformation and evolution, Rob, one of the things that you and the Converseon team did last year was to launch a new report that I believe was called The Forces of Change. What it highlighted, which I found to be very interesting, was how your social listening technology captured key consumer trends during the pandemic, during the global pandemic.
Right.
So tell us a little bit about these consumer trends that your technology was able to pick up related to COVID-19, and in particular how there's sort of an evolving culture that the social listening technology has picked up, and in particular, if you could share a little bit of perspective on how this is going to impact the world of PR.
Yeah. Well, certainly, I feel kind of very Buddhist when I say this, but I think it just reaffirmed the COVID experience and all the other kind of transformation that's going beyond around us. Kind of gets back to that old saying that change is the only constant, right? And so with COVID, it really accelerated something that we've been seeing anyhow, and that is that traditionally, when you're doing kind of measurement research and think about brand tracking or et cetera, or trend tracking, is many times you're doing kind of survey-based approaches that are kind of asking the same questions, and you're getting kind of the same answers, and you're doing it periodically. But they're pretty static approaches. But the challenge is that the world around us is changing all the time. So what social data allows us to do uniquely is to find those things that we don't know to look for, the knowable unknowns, those we talk about them. So what we were able to do with COVID, and by the way, we're doing this, whether it's BLM, whether it's voting rights in Georgia, whatever it might happen to be, whether it happens to be certain need states or conditions, whether it's, oral care or beauty and health or automotive, we're able to use our technology. Our core technology is something called Converseon. It's an auto NLP technology. I think a lot of people might be familiar with machine learning as a service. This is NLP as a service, where people can build and deploy their own models, or we can provide them for you, whatever it might happen to be. So, and you don't have to be a data scientist to do this. So we put all the data within this, and bubbling up are all these needs, wants, attributes, et cetera, expressed through social data that often get missed in survey-based approaches. And so we did this for COVID across different categories. And, not surprisingly, we were able to find things like, the growth of safety, et cetera, new attributes that are emerging, new demands that are emerging, new unmet needs that are emerging, both from COVID. But again, it's almost weekly where there's some new issue where companies are expected to take a stand. And, what we've seen happen around all of this is brands being pulled into by consumers and expected to make the world a better place, right? So there were expectations, whether it was Delta Airlines helping to fly PPP in, whether it was Walmart letting folks use their parking lots to do testing. There was an expectation that companies needed to get involved. Don't sit on the sidelines, make the world a better place. Now, that's something that's been happening for a while, and it's accelerated. So all these issues are accelerating this requirement for brands to have a brand purpose. And that brand purpose is articulated by the Business Roundtable. And some of you may be aware that in 2019, the Business Roundtable, the influencer business group, made a change to what its purpose of the corporation was. Previous to that, it was the very Milton Friedman. The only reason a brand operates is to a return on investment for its investors. Well, in 2019, and this is pre-COVID, Jamie Dimon, who was the chair of it at the time, 187 major brands came out with a statement that said, no, the purpose of a corporation is different. It's to make the world a better place and to help do stakeholder capitalism, right? Serve communities, serve employees, serve others beyond just shareholders. And that was a major ordeal. Forbes magazine said this may be the most important business announcement in decades. But Harvard Business Review said right after that, well, yes, maybe, if you can measure it, because you can't manage what you can't measure, and you can't measure what you can't define. So how do we hold these folks to account? Well, the Business Roundtable said clearly in its announcement, well, social media is not only a driver of this, but it's also putting us under a level of scrutiny where our actions are going to be measured in terms of what we do. So what we did is measure not just did people like certain announcements that they made, and certain companies came out and they were making announcements. It was yes. Do they trust that the companies would follow through with these announcements? So that's where a trust model was important to recognize, that people may like something, but there was a lagging indicator of trust to see if they were actually going to follow through with it. There's great sensitivity. I mean, the folks in social media, which is very representative to opinion more broadly, or whether it's greenwashing or woke washing or other things as well, they're really looking closely at what these folks are doing. So what does that mean is I think it puts public relations actually in the driver's seat. I see public relations, an enlightened form of public relations, at the forefront of navigating this, because companies haven't had navigating this is challenging. They need information, they need insights, they need to understand how folks are going to react to things. Not making a decision is making a decision. And whether it's Coca-Cola being pulled into voting rights in Georgia, et cetera, it's a really exciting time. But the public relations industry has not had the tools until now to help get a seat at the table and drive drive through this challenging kind of roadmap that CEOs are dealing with every day. But that's changed.
One aspect of that, Rob, is just the wide range of maturity levels
Right.
that exists in PR functions, both for organizations large and small. And when I talk to organizations, there is just such an interesting reaction to the notion of leveraging AI to make key communications decisions. For some organizations, there's a ton of enthusiasm. For some, it's perhaps seems like a distant kind of dream, far, far away.
Mhm.
But on this topic, you've conducted some really interesting research to highlight essentially what amounts to the practical aspects of AI for everyday communications professionals. And this is, I think, a topic that there's a wide range of perspectives on, and I would probably argue that there's a wide range of disagreement on. So your perspective, Rob, on this, in terms of how PR professionals can think about AI in practical terms, is it still a dream, or has it come true?
Yeah, it's becoming pervasive. Whether all the dots are connected, not yet. What's really interesting is that AI is able to see patterns in data that humans cannot see, essentially. And there's so many different variables. There's so many connectors. There's so many possibilities that AI becomes a great assistance in that process. But I like to start from the perspective of what is public relations really. And if we want to define it, kind of as we're talking about here, that it's not just kind of media relations and putting content out. Because by the way, there is AI, and I'm going to really call it, let's be more specific, machine learning, that will help you determine what time of day you put out a press release or what content is most resonating. And those are kind of tactical uses of AI. And those are fine. Those are helpful. Those are assistants, do more with less, that type of thing. If we believe that PR is the guardian of reputation and the driver of reputation, which I believe it is, then AI is absolutely essential, because reputation is everything, right? Had a good conversation with Leslie Gaines Ross not long ago. Some of you may know, formerly Weber, who was pointing this out, that reputation seems nebulous because it is everything. Everything that is out there impacts reputation. So if we're going to really create some definition around reputation, if we're going to then measure reputation, and if we're going to tie those reputation measurements to something of business value, such as shareholder value, which we are doing, then AI plays an important role in that. The way it plays an important role with that is, first of all, it's the classification, the capture and classification of language. I mean, these conversations are happening at massive scale, globally, in real time. How do you possibly listen to, analyze, and classify language on that scale, which any of those can really make an impact, potentially, on reputation? That's what machine learning is. Now, what everybody throws around in terms of AI is largely machine learning still. The machine learning algorithms are learning from human input and then mimicking human performance and outperforming humans at some level. Real AI actually takes those learnings and then does something about it, right? So it takes an action. We're largely not there. So there's been kind of a muddy of the waters about what AI is and what it is not. Will it replace humans? Will it not? I think the conversation has to be much more nuanced. There is good AI or good machine learning, and this is what I am describing as very precise, rigorously developed, tested and validated, know exactly how well your model is performing versus the gold standard. And there is bad AI, which is slapped together, which is overhyped, which is promoted in some ways on purpose for marketing efforts because everyone wants to be in the AI game. So I think PR folks have to become much more educated on good AI, bad AI. What are the questions I need to ask my vendor, anyone who's going to do this, in terms of what process are they using to use their AI to develop and provide their AI. One thing I would simply say to that, even if you don't want to get into all the sausage making of how these models work, but it's important to understand that, where does the training data come from? How do you validate models? How well do they perform? Do they generalize? Meaning, do they work on multiple different brands or only on your brand? How are they updated, et cetera, et cetera? Make sure that even if you're using a social listening platform, know how good your model is. Usually it's an F1 score, meaning precision and recall. And I won't get into the details of that, but anything above a 0.80 or 0.75 F1 score is usually pretty good. So AI is essential for capturing this data, classifying this data, finding the patterns in the data that then can correlate to business outcomes for predictive analytics. Whether that's product sales, which we've been able to do. It's lifetime value, which we've been able to do. In terms of shareholder value, we've been able to do. All of that can only happen through AI. Humans, it would take a decade to go through all this data and get to something that's really meaningful. Here, we're doing it at the speed of, almost near real time. And or what we sometimes say is the speed of relevance, fast enough that you can do something about it. So on a practical level, this measurement is going to open the doors for public relations if it's embraced in ways that we haven't seen historically. And that because we're now being able to define and measure reputation in an always-on world at the speed of relevance, no dipsticks, discovering things that you didn't know to look for. And we're now going to tie all of that we did this for one of the largest CPG companies. They've been able to predict shareholder value on that. So, that's kind of been their nirvana in measurement. So we are making these connections, and that's all through AI. But it has to be good AI, it has to be smart AI, it has to be rigorous AI, it has to be non-biased AI, right? Which is really critical because a lot of machine learning models, if they learn from humans, they can learn from people who are biased or have confirmation bias or whatever it might happen to be. And there's a lot of regulations that are bubbling under the surface here that are going to require brands to make sure that the machine learning models they use, the AI they use, is built properly and avoids unintended bias. But that's where we are. So in a world, I sometimes say this, in a world where sometimes real time is not fast enough, and we live in that world, we're anticipating the next challenge or value or issue or pandemic or whatever it might happen to be. This use of AI with natural language processing and advanced analytics, we use Bayesian statistics. If you're using just kind of volume scores, don't. But I could talk more. That's an entirely different conversation. You can help predict the future. You can get to the future faster. You can help your CEO and your companies get to the future faster or make the right decisions, navigate through very challenging, foggy environments to make the right decisions. And that's game changing.
Rob, what you described, it almost seems like a paradigm shift from what I think of as monitoring, which I think over the past several years, there's been a lot of conversation about monitoring, social monitoring, media monitoring, et cetera, to more of a predictive, anticipation-oriented sort of approach. And a lot of the technology that you're describing has, of course, enabled that. But I can even recall as recently as, let's say, 7, 8 years ago, the world's leading chief communications officers, they dreamt of tools that had like an early detection, early warning system kind of capability, something that could not just monitor the crisis once it had occurred, but something that could anticipate the crisis based upon conversations amongst different demographic and psychographic groups. And that's what's so exciting about the potential. A lot of public relations peers in terms of functions, finance and marketing and HR and sales, et cetera, they're a couple of years ahead of PR in the sense that they have a lot of tools that allow the function to have kind of like a forward-looking view on, on how the world is evolving. And I think it's exciting that PR is finally getting to that point. Rob, as we wrap up this discussion, I want to sort of get your big picture perspective on what's ahead. 2020 and 2021 have just changed so much for PR and communications in particular. A lot of the components that you mentioned, like environmental and social governance,
Right.
misinformation, disinformation, a lot of the sort of social um, topics and important issues that have really pushed brands to participate more and take positions. This, I think many would argue, has just fundamentally changed, um, whether it's internal comms, external, et cetera, the whole outlook and view of public relations. And I think 2020 and 2021, the pandemic in particular, has accelerated a lot of this change. But in terms of how you see the future, Rob,
Hmm.
with when you combine the technology trends with the social trends, with corporations having a more present sort of social conscious and more active as corporate citizens, what does this mean for PR and communications in the years ahead? In terms of expectations, in terms of goals, in terms of orientations. Fascinated to get your perspective on that. And I would just add one thing, to that, which is that a dear friend of mine, he characterized this outlook of PR as as kind of a shift from a function uh, that was kind of more about, let's say, language, to a function that's kind of having a quantitative, transformation and redefinition. What's your view on that, and what's your overall outlook for PR and
Yeah.
communications moving forward?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, as someone who grew up in the world of PR and then kind of went off into the wilderness, and we've been working in the world of NLP, but also applying a lot of our technologies for advertisers and brand tracking and other things as well, where kind of there was a kind of a little greater level of maturity, I think, in terms of measurement. I'm very bullish on kind of where PR should go, and the way I look at it is it's this convergence of the technology. Of course, it's language, but it's also a business outcome that we can now measure. We have all this data everywhere, and what has to happen, I think, from a corporate comms or reputation piece is to start to think a little bit differently. I mean, for number one is, you know, reinforce this concept of reputation. They're steward for reputation, and because this reputation scoring that we're talking about can actually explain shareholder value in many cases, that becomes a core KPI at the CEO, at the C-suite level. So you're now at the table. So but measurement is critical to that, and sometimes folks don't want to spend the money on measurement, like you have a limited budget, et cetera. But if you can't manage what you can't measure and you can't measure what you can't define, we've got to start with that. So we're now going to be able to start to show the impact of the levers of reputation and what the impact is on business outcome, of real business value. But that means that the PR function has to get more horizontal, right? Not so vertical, but more horizontal, because what you're going to be measuring within those frameworks, it includes customer experience, includes social responsibility, it includes product innovation, et cetera, all have to feed back into those various groups within organizations so they can do something about it, right? So it's getting out of the comfort zone of only measuring the stuff that you're used to and measuring stuff that has broader application within the company. It's always going to be always on, so that this measurement is going to be always on. It's going to be always actionable. We're finding that, and a lot of data says this to us, that this concept of CSR, or corporate social responsibility, or some people talk about ESG, which is investment framework, environmental social governance, plus trust are key drivers, essential drivers for reputation. So that's going to be requiring the PR function to start to connect with that part of the organization as well. There's frameworks out there. We have measurement frameworks to be able to measure the perceptions of companies' efforts in ESG, which is going to investment communities. I mean, the investment in ESG type companies has grown exponentially. So that's going to play a role there. Trust is going to be essential. They got to get past the sentiment and get to real core trusts that, I may like somebody, but doing business with somebody is a little bit different. And there's going to be this concept of misinformation and disinformation keep coming up. So yes, reputation is essential. Misinformation and disinformation are more challenging problems in terms of the application of AI, et cetera, et cetera. And there isn't any simple answer to this currently. For things that are established facts, it's easier to do. You should be monitoring that, correcting misinformation. We were founded in so-and-so year, not this so-and-so year. Our CEO is the first person, not that person's, whatever it might happen to be. Those things are doable. The vast amount of misinformation or disinformation is largely seen through prisms of individuals that it's very difficult for an algorithm to be able to snuff that out easily. So, I mean, think about just sentiment analysis where people disagree. When you start to get to real clarity of identifying disinformation and active disinformation, misinformation, everybody's working hard on it. It still remains a challenge. You need humans in the loop. And I would say, by the way, with all AI, it's essential that humans remain in the loop, that they're there to help train the models, but they're there to make sure this AI doesn't go off the rails and being used in bad ways. So there's a role for the public relations industry to be there as well. So between monitoring for that, because by the way, that can impact reputation, and really reinventing measurement of reputation, tying it to outcome and working more broadly across the organization, I think public relations is well positioned to be in the driver's seat and becoming maybe one of the most important components of organizations as they move through this values-driven, erratic, polarized world that we live in. So all the parts are there now. The components are there, but it's going to require an enlightened group of corporate comm leaders to really make this model work. And we see some of the big PR firms are making investments, in technology and others too. Great to see, slightly overdue in some cases, but we're here now. So now's the time to get on it because your companies need you, your CEO needs you, they need help, and you're in the position to do it.
Thanks for sharing your perspective, Rob. I think this is a great combination of both strategic and tactical recommendations for public relations and communications executive. We get a lot of perspectives on this video cast from the agency world. We get a lot of perspectives from the world of academia, but it's rare for us to get the perspective of the technologist that's kind of pioneering a new way of doing what PR is really meant to do. So thank you for sharing your insights and recommendations. This has been a blast, and we look forward to having you again on the show.
Yeah, thanks, Mo. Thanks for everyone for listening.
All right, Rob. And for our listeners, we'll be back to you with another episode of Measuring Up in just about a week. Thanks for tuning in.